Hi, good morning. I'm Linda and welcome to my kitchen. Today we're going to be baking something that sounds really ambitious, but actually it's pretty simple to do once you know how to do it. We're going to be baking bread, and homemade bread is always a hit. It's always spectacular. Everyone loves it. And I found this recipe years ago. My mom actually found it when I was a teenager. We used to bake it together up at the cottage, and I've been using it on and off, mostly off since then, but I've gotten back into baking bread a little bit every now and then, and so I thought this is a great opportunity to do a video about it. My recipe comes from a book that's called Food That Really Schmecks. So it's Mennonite cookbook. A lot of amazing recipes in here. And of course, with this basic bread dough recipe, you can make cinnamon rolls, buns, so many other things. So I will, as usual, include the recipe in the description below so that you can use that. And with baking bread, there are a few things that you need to think about ahead of time to make sure that you have on hand. Lots of flour is one of them. Yeast is another. And good baking pans, loaf pans, are another. And I'll show you what I have. I only spent maybe about $10 each on them, but they're sturdy and they're thick, and they will make sure that the bread cooks properly. With baking bread, the other things you need to do are, if you have long hair, make sure your hair is tied back so that it doesn't get in your recipe for obvious reasons. And make sure both your hands are really clean and the surface that you're going to be working on, because you're going to be doing a lot of kneading, and you want to make sure that your finished product, everyone is comfortable with the sanitation and cleaning practices, healthy hands and surface practices that you use. So for me, I'm really careful about that, and I encourage you to be the same. So I'll show you what I have here for tools and ingredients. Now, this recipe calls for a ceramic bowl or pottery bowl, and I don't have one, so I actually have the inside of my crock pot, and I've used it many times. It actually works really well, so you know, that can make a great substitute. The other tools that I need, I mentioned the loaf pans. These are Lagostina. You can see they're a little bit thick. Again, I didn't pay tons of money for them, but they're non-stick and they've done a great job. I've got a wooden spoon, a 1 cup, a half cup, a tablespoon, and I also need a teaspoon, which I'm going to need to grab. For ingredients, flour, obviously, which is over here, white sugar, yeast, and oil are the main ingredients. Another thing that I keep on hand is a cue card that has the number of cups of flour that I'm going to be adding, because it's really easy to lose count. So every time I put a cup of flour in, I cross it off. The recipe that I'm going to be posting is for 3 loaves of bread. I'm going to be just making a 2/3 recipe today, so I'm going to be making 2 loaves of bread. So I'll give you those measurements throughout the video, but if you want to make the full recipe, then you can see those in the description below this video. So when you're only making a 2/3 recipe, it only calls for 6 cups of flour instead of 9. Don't worry about finding a warm place for your dough to rise. I've found that if about 10 minutes before you need to have your dough rise, if you turn your oven on to its lowest setting, and then as soon as it beeps, turn it off, then that will have your oven be a nice warm place where your dough isn't cooking, but it's going to be rising nicely. Okay, I think we're ready to go ahead and get started. The first thing that the recipe recommends is that before you add your first ingredients, you put some hot water into your bowl to warm it up. And I've done that. I put some hot water in, I've warmed it up. I'm gonna go ahead and dump that out now. And for this recipe, I need 2/3 of a cup of lukewarm water, so I'll get that at the same time. Okay, I now realize that the measuring cups that I got out are for the 3-loaf recipe, so I've just gone ahead and grabbed all of my measuring cups, and so I'll just keep them on hand and use whatever I need. So let's start with 2/3 of a cup of lukewarm water. Lukewarm is warmer than room temperature, but not hot. And a 1/2 teaspoon of white sugar. I've got 1 teaspoon out, so I'm just going to fill it half full. Now the recipe calls for the sugar to be dissolved in the water, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stir it around until I can't see it anymore. The next step says over the water to sprinkle your yeast. And for 2 loaves of bread, that requires 2 tablespoons of yeast. We want to make sure to sprinkle this and leave it on top of the water. Now, this yeast mixture needs to stand for about 10 minutes so that the yeast can do its thing. So we are going to come back in about 10 minutes and do our next step. Okay, about 10 minutes has elapsed and I'm back. A couple things that this is a good time to do is rewash your hands thoroughly, and this time you want to wash them up your arm too a little bit, because in this next stage, once we've worked the flour in, we're going to be using our hands and wrists quite a bit. It's good to remove your watch before you wash your hands and leave that off. I also realized that I needed salt for this part, so I got that out, as you can see. And I've turned my oven on to its lowest possible temperature, which is 170 degrees. And as soon as it warms up, I'm going to turn it off so that I have a warm but not hot oven. Okay, for our yeast mixture, you can see that the yeast has kind of formed a topping on the water, and we need to stir this in now so that it's completely dissolved, and that might take a few minutes. It's really important that the yeast is fully dissolved. So I'm just going to go ahead and stir until it looks about right. Now, actually, this time, unlike other times, it seems that the yeast granules have really dissolved while I was waiting. Quite often I will see little grains in there, but I'm not seeing any this time, and it looks like the mixture is really well mixed together. So I think I could go ahead and move on. And that means I need to add, for 2 loaves of bread, 1 1/3 cups of lukewarm water. So I'm going to go ahead and get my lukewarm water. Okay, I got that. Now we're going to add 1/3 of a cup of white sugar. Sounds like a lot, but I'm telling you, this recipe is excellent, so I'm not questioning it. I'm just going to sprinkle that over top of the yeast mixture. Three-quarters of a tablespoon, which a heaping tablespoon, which is probably more like 2 teaspoons of salt. Again, it sounds like a lot, but I'm not going to question it. It says heaping, so that's what I'm going to do. And 1/3 of a cup of oil or melted shortening. I'm using vegetable or canola oil. Oh, there's my oven, so I'm going to go turn that off now. Now, this all needs to be mixed together. Now the recipe says beat and then stir in 1 cup at a time, the flour. I don't think I'm going to get my beaters out. I'm just going to give this a really good stir with my wooden spoon. Okay, now we're going to stir in 1 cup at a time, approximately 6 cups of flour. So I'm going to get out my crossing list here because I'm going to use that, and I'll dump a cup of flour in and stir and repeat. So that's 1. You don't have to stir till it's completely mixed, especially near the beginning. I'm going to go ahead and pour the second one in and mark it off. I'm going to get my third one and dump it in. And get my fourth one ready. Let's mark off number 3. Okay, you can see that the mixture is starting to look more and more like dough. I'm glad that I have been taking note of how much flour I've been putting in, because it's really hard to forget, especially if you have a brain like mine. I'm going to go ahead and dump number 5 in and mark it off, and set number 6 to the side. Now this says about 6 cups. So it says mix till it requires muscle. You might need to add another ½ a cup of water to work in the last 2 cupfuls of flour. So that's what I'm gonna do, is get a bit more water because this is looking very doughy. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to top this up with flour because I may need it for working the dough. And I'm going to dump this dough onto the counter. Scrape down my bowl. Now this is when the kneading comes in. So what I'm doing is I'm basically just gathering the outsides of the dough into the middle. This is actually kind of fun, working this dough. You need to do this for several minutes. I need to add more flour. And we're doing this until the dough is a little bit smooth and elastic, it says. Might still have a few sticky spots. But I'll show you what I like my dough to look like for it to be ready to rise. Okay, the dough is starting to get there. You can't over knead the dough, and by that I mean you can keep kneading it. It's not one of those things where the more you knead it, the harder it gets. So I'm going to do it for another minute or two, and that should be good enough. Okay, so this is what my dough looks like now. You can see it's definitely well mixed together. It's smooth, it's a little bit shiny, and this is actually, you have now finished your hardest part, if you can call that hard, of making bread. We're going to put the dough back in to our bowl, and you can get any bits of dough off your hands onto there. Put a little bit of flour on top. Now, all we need to do now is cover it with wax paper. I like to put a tea towel on top as well, and then we're going to put it in the oven. It says 1 to 2 hours. Basically, we're looking for the dough to double in size. So kind of take note of what it looks like now. Add your wax paper and towel. Put it in your oven or a nice warm place. This is quick rise dough, so it might only take an hour or so. So let's check back in a little while. Okay, it's been about an hour, and I just took this crock pot out of the oven, and you can see it's got a lump there in the middle. So we're going to go ahead and take this back, and well, the dough has risen a lot more than twice its size, so that is perfect. We're going to go ahead and do our next steps now. Okay, so I've done a few things since we last talked. One is I put away all of the things that I don't need anymore, wiped down my counters, had breakfast, went for a walk, and came back and checked on the dough, which has risen well. That's excellent. I got out some shortening to grease my loaf pans, and even though they're non-stick, I don't want to take any chances. I used to use margarine or butter, but I found that it would burn sometimes, and I don't really like that taste in the bread, so someone told me that if you grease the pan with shortening, it's better. So that's what I've been doing. Now, wash my hands again very thoroughly up to the wrist, because we're going to be manipulating the dough again, and we need flour. So I still have some flour left from before. So our next step is to go ahead and punch the dough down. Get rid of the air bubbles. And my dough actually feels quite warm. I maybe should have set my oven sooner and turned it off a little earlier, but it doesn't seem to have cooked the dough in the slightest, so that's good. Now, it says to drench the dough with flour, which I recommend since mine has started to get sticky again, and divide it into 3 or 6 loaves. So what I'm going to do is actually divide it into 3 loaves, and then 3 parts, and then I'm going to divide each part into 2, and I'll show you why. Oh, I just realized that actually that was for making 3 loaves. So since I'm only making 2, what I need is to divide this into 4, or half and half again. So that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna divide this into half, and then half again. Lots of flour. Make sure the air bubbles are out. I'm going to divide this into half. Now the reason I like to do it in half and half again is that this makes kind of like 2 half loaves in your pan, and that makes it really easy if you're a small family to take a half a loaf of bread. So this is kind of like 1 loaf or 2 halves, depending on which you prefer. Very simple. The dough feels really good in my hands. Work it to get all the air bubbles out, and then you'll notice I'm kind of forming it into almost like a mushroom. And we'll put that right into the pan. This time the dough is not going to need to rise for quite as long. But again, the important thing is not how long the dough rises for, but how tall it gets. So I've got my 4 half loaves in here. Now what I want to do is sprinkle the top with flour so that the wax paper doesn't stick to it. You don't want a ton of flour because this is what the top of your bread is going to look like. But you do need some flour to keep the wax paper from sticking. So we're all ready to plop this back in the oven. You saw that was quick and simple. Bread is not hard to make, and it'll be maybe another half hour, 45 minutes, an hour even if necessary. And I put the wax paper towel on. As soon as this has risen up to a good height, however tall you want your bread to be, and let's face it, nobody wants skinny little bread, then that's when we're going to be ready to take it out and cook it. I'm just going to give you a little hint about scraping down your bowl. It's always hard to wash out a bowl that's got flour and dough sticking to it. So I have a little scraper here, and any kind of thin scraper will do. And if you just run that right along, that's really going to get out most of the crusty dough and flour. You're going to dump that right in your compost and then let it soak with hot soapy water for a short time. It'll wash up really easily. Okay, I just took the loaves out of the rising place, which is my oven. And as you can see, they've risen really nicely. I could let them rise more, but what I want is loaves that are a good size, but will still fit in my toaster. So those are out now. I think I'll just maybe put the wax paper back on until my oven is the right temperature. You put your oven on to 400 degrees, wait till it's fully preheated, and then you cook the bread. Let me just double check the time on that. Okay, my cookbook says 400 degrees for about 20 minutes till it's getting to be golden brown. I will definitely want to be keeping a close eye on that. And I've got a note for my oven that if you make rolls, you cook at 425 for about 12 minutes. So that's a good ballpark if you choose to make rolls instead of loaves. So we'll check back when the finished product is here and see how it is. Okay, so here's the finished product. 2 delicious homemade loaves of bread. Now, I only cooked these for 18 minutes, so it's definitely a good idea to keep a close eye on these because these are definitely finished. And the recipe says to take them out of the pans right away and to cool them on a cooling rack. With the shortening greased pans, I had no problem getting these out of their pans at all. They slid right out, and I'm really excited about this. So, fresh homemade bread. Wasn't that hard, was it? So go ahead and make this anytime you like. Feel free to subscribe to my channel. If the baking interests you, feel free to share it with others. And thank you very much for watching.